Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation on how to give a policy talk, adapted from Jesse M. Shapiro's How to Give an Applied Micro Talk. The purpose of these slides is to help you prepare a research question, background information, and slides for your 3-minute thesis and for the submission of your capstone research proposal. So what should be your motivation in listening to this video? First, your audience is unlikely to know much about your subject matter. You have just one slide to change their mind and 3 minutes to make your point. So you have to make the following count: your policy question or research question, framing facts or the facts that you consider essential to understanding the above question, and any figures, tables, or graphics you include. While we're focused here on a 3-minute thesis and the submission of your research proposal, this same 3-minute constraint actually applies in other settings. In other presentations, if you cannot convince your audience of MPs, MLAs, donors, senior officials, and others in the first few minutes of the importance of your work within 1 or 2 slides, you'll have lost most of them for the majority of your presentation. Your research question is the most important part of your thesis and research proposal. It is the hook for presenters and engages them in the topic, data, and methods you're going to show them. This is true in your 3-minute thesis and the other proposals that you'll make throughout your career. So we're going to spend a good chunk of this presentation on what makes a good research question and what does not. The first thing you should do is evaluate the importance of your research question. One way to measure importance of a research topic in public policy is to measure its positive or negative impact on people. If X changes, are many people worse off or better off? Are important subpopulations worse off or better off? Of course, you might not know the answers to these right now, but that's what makes a good research question, is its potential to make people worse off or better off. Worse off or better off here could be measured by health, income, some measure of happiness or satisfaction, or any other type of variable you might define in a survey or interview. Another way to measure the goodness of a research question is if it's controversial or puzzling. This might be a topic that's controversial in the general public, such as, let's say, a carbon tax, even if it might not be particularly controversial among academics or economists on the subject. Or it could be something that's controversial or puzzling among academics, while not necessarily a big topic of public conversation. An example from my research is whether or not immigration actually improves per capita GDP. The impact of immigrants on GDP per capita isn't necessarily a major topic of public conversation, but it is something that's fairly controversial among academics in the subject. A third way to measure the goodness of a research question is if the subject matter is common or involves large outlays of social, fiscal, or time resources. Now, I said earlier that the people you're presenting to might not know a lot about your research or subject matter. This still holds true here. I know a lot about immigration, but I do not know a lot about freshwater on indigenous reserves. But the subject matter is common enough that I know that it is an issue. I just don't know enough to make a good research question out of it, and that's where you might step in if you want to take on that subject. When I say large outlays of social, fiscal, or time resources, this just means that society spends a lot of resources on this, resources in money, resources in social capital, time, volunteer hours, etc. So if the research matter is fairly common knowledge, even if it's not deep knowledge, or it involves these large expenditures in resources, that might make a very good public policy question. And finally, a good research question is going to consider how you can apply the approaches, theories, or models in public policy that you've learned throughout your MPP in order to make predictions. You've learned certain approaches or models of thinking in the course of your MPP courses right so far. Some of these might include median voter theorem, public choice theory, elite theory. These are all different ways to think about how we form or make public policy. And if you can apply those theories in a research question in order to make predictions, that is a very good way to measure the goodness of a research question. Of course, when I say predictions, that can mean quantitative predictions. A lot of empirical researchers will make specific quantitative predictions, but these can also be qualitative predictions as well. Public choice theory, for example, can predict that people in certain neighborhoods might collectively oppose a new development because of interests of rent seeking. The current structure of the neighborhood improves the value of their property, and they might oppose new developments that might bring down that value, for example. That's not necessarily a quantitative prediction, but it is a prediction that we can make from public policy research and apply it as a research question. Okay, so now we're going to actually think of some ways in which we can frame our research question. The first way we're going to consider is what's called a counterfactual question. This is the what if scenario. This is where we impose a condition that currently doesn't exist and consider the outcomes that might happen if we impose that scenario or if we had those types of conditions. Let's look at the following examples here. What would happen to employment by neighborhood if Calgary built Plan X of the Green Line? What would happen to refugee claims if Canada dropped out of the Safe Third Country Agreement? And what would happen to revenue streams if Alberta had diverted its resource revenues entirely to the Heritage Fund? This allows us to analyze outcome measures by making certain assumptions about the conditions of the world in which we imagine. Outcome measures here can be a quantitative measure. It can also be a qualitative measure. We might do a case study on what would happen to the quality of life of various individuals if they were to, say, have more shelter beds at the Homeless Foundation here in Calgary. You can also frame your research question around a deep parameter, which is to say, how do preferences, technologies, and constraints interact and change with policy rollout? Believe it or not, deep parameters affect your daily life, though you might not realize it. But put very succinctly, signals and expectations matter, as does technology, beyond the hoped outcome of a public policy rollout. I'm going to start here with an example of why deep parameters matter to public policy analysis, why you're probably already considering them already, and why you should probably include them either in your research question or somewhere in your capstone project. Though you don't necessarily have to use the phrase deep parameter, but just consider how they might affect the impact of a policy analysis. So, as I said, why do we consider deep parameters when doing public policy analysis? We're going to use the Fort Knox example. Fort Knox is a facility in the United States where the US government keeps all of its gold reserves. Fort Knox has never been robbed once in US history. That is my attempt at an awful dollar sign. If you're to do a public policy analysis without considering deep parameters, you might conclude that the security at Fort Knox is unnecessary. You'll say there's no proof of an attempt to rob Fort Knox before. The security haven't done anything to stop robbery attempts. Therefore, why do we need the security at Fort Knox? Why do we need the technology? Let's get rid of the security and save taxpayers' money and increase their welfare. This is intuitively a very silly deduction, because one very obvious reason why there probably haven't been any robberies at Fort Knox is because robbers know of the security there, and they know that they're very likely to get caught and prosecuted. The robbers react to the constraints that they're faced with, and so they don't try to rob Fort Knox. Therefore, you can't go into the public policy analysis and just look at things that happen and things that might happen in the future without considering deep parameters, or you might make spurious conclusions. I'm going to use a couple other examples here. The Bank of Canada over the past couple of years has routinely lowered interest rates in order to encourage spending, to encourage loans, to keep the Canadian economy moving. People react to different interest rates and might choose to get a loan depending on how comfortable they are with the interest rate as is. But what if they anticipate future cuts to the interest rate? What if they anticipate future hikes to the interest rate? If there are future hikes to the interest rate, they might say, well, now is a really, really good time to get a loan because I don't know if interest rates are going to go up in the future. So I'm going to get a loan and buy a house right now. Or they might anticipate that there are going to be future interest loan reduction cuts. And they'll say, well, I'll put off getting a mortgage because, well, I think the interest rates are going to go down and I'm going to get one at a lower rate. Now we're going to get a bit more in depth into policy. As well experienced over the past year or so, there have been various restrictions put in place and lifted at various times here in Alberta with regard to COVID-19. Back in the early winter, when case numbers were going up quite quickly, the Alberta government introduced new restrictions. And they said they're going to go into place at a certain date, usually in advance of when they announced them. There might have been individuals who said, well, let's go out to the bar now because we know that in a few days there's going to be a policy, although obviously they didn't probably think of it in terms of policy, but there's going to be a policy restricting us from our ability to go out to the bar, to meet family, etc. They were reacting in anticipation of a rule change or a policy change. So we might actually see, leading up to the restriction, case numbers go up in and around the time that the restriction was implemented. But then we see case numbers begin to drop. If you didn't consider deep parameters, then you might say, we expect case numbers to fully drop due to the restrictions, but then you end up seeing a spike in case numbers just right as the restrictions come into place, and you might conclude that restrictions don't work, when in fact what was happening is that people were reacting to the anticipation of those restrictions. And finally, using a very recent example, as we roll out the vaccine here in Alberta, people have been encouraged over the age of 75 to be able to go and sign up for a vaccine. If we didn't consider bandwidth or server capacity, we might conclude that there is a certain number of people who are likely to sign up for a vaccine on the first day. The day after, we download the data on the number of individuals who signed up for vaccines, and we see that it's quite lower. And we might conclude, wow, maybe people are very vaccine hesitant here in Alberta. Maybe they don't want to get the vaccine. But if we don't consider the deep parameter of technology, and that maybe the server was overloaded and the Alberta website went down, we would come to that spurious conclusion that Albertans were more vaccine hesitant when really it was just a matter there was a bottleneck on the rollout of that policy. I hope this is giving you an idea of why you might want to include deep parameters, and you might even want to include them in the aspect of a research question. How do people anticipate policy changes? What can we consider in terms of technology for future public policy rollouts to make sure that the anticipated number of, let's say, vaccine rollouts matches what we actually end up getting, and that we aren't limited by server bandwidth. All that is to say is consider people's preferences and constraints when and anticipations when a public policy rollout is happening. Make sure you include that in your capstone, but you might also want to include it in your research question. And finally, this is something we touched on earlier, but you might also want to consider including an aspect of theory or approach in your research question on public policy. I give two examples here. Does median voter theorem hold when election policies permit third-party donation? Lisa Young might have touched on this in her classes, but median voter theorem, put very succinctly, is that we expect politicians to move to the center of the binary political spectrum during election campaigns in order to sort of grab the moderate voter, the voter in the center. But does that theorem hold when there's large amounts of donations going to PACs, and those PACs have a major influence on the politician? Does that politician maybe stay further right or further left because they're beholden to donors? I'm not saying that's the case, but that might be like how you introduce the aspect of theory into public policy and how you structure your election laws and your election policies. Donation caps on donations to third parties, etc. Another example here. Did elite theory predict the fiscal response by the Canadian government in relation to COVID-19? Elite theory, put very succinctly, if you haven't learned it already, is that the elites in society, those are pundits, academics, policymakers, politicians, bureaucrats, and others. They're the ones who drive policy discourse and encourage public support for the policy. That policy is a top-down exercise, and even polarization is a top-down exercise rather than a bottom-up. In this example, beyond CERB, there was a number of Canadian government initiatives around, let's say, the summer jobs program that you could make an argument for that there was an elite-driven response about how Canadian dollars should be spent on those programs. And you might want to cover how does elite theory frame the federal government fiscal response in relation to crises. These could make for two very good capstone projects. And they involve theories that you may or may not have covered in class. For more on public policy theory, you might want to talk with Lisa Young and try to get some more reading material on that. But at the end of the day, a good research question could probably just touch on one of the last three slides that we covered. Again, it could include a counterfactual, a consideration of deep parameters, the involvement of theory. A really good research question will actually include all three aspects of this, but don't try to force it. Again, covering theory of public policy analysis, anticipated responses to public policy analysis, and what-if scenarios are all really good ways to frame a public policy research question. Last thing we're going to touch on with regards to research questions is how not to frame them. Research questions are motivated by public policy and not the public policy literature. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not saying you shouldn't do a lit review, nor am I saying that you shouldn't take inspiration from the literature. Those are in fact both very necessary parts to forming a good research question, a good research proposal, a 3-minute thesis, and your larger capstone research project. In fact, they are vital. What I'm really trying to say here is you should start by thinking about the important issue, the importance of your project, and not necessarily dive into a research project that's based solely on what others have written. When doing a literature review, that might even be more important. The point of a literature review isn't just to summarize what others have said. In the context of public policy, it is to look at a very important research question or public policy issue and say, we're going to try to answer or solve this public policy issue by looking at all the literature that has been put forward, by looking at the arguments and counter arguments, by seeing which ones make the best arguments, putting those ones forward, putting the other ones to rest, and crafting a cohesive narrative or a cohesive story about this public policy issue based on the work of others. In fact, it's quite likely that other researchers who produced original literature haven't looked at this cohesive narrative in terms of what other authors are writing. And that gives you a chance to kind of collect all of it, organize it, again, put the caveats in there, what does work, what doesn't work, and try to answer that policy question. Again, it's not a summary. It's an organization of others' literature, of framing your own argument based on what others have said, and putting forth your best foot on why you think this is the right decision on this particular issue. So again, start with the issue, start with the problem, and then go into the literature rather than starting with the literature necessarily and trying to then create a research question out of it. Again, if you don't follow this, these are some of the risks that you fall into. Research questions are not what happens if we apply X model to the public sector Y. The question is just too vague and open-ended. It doesn't actually address a public policy issue. There is not a problem inherent in this question. The outcome might be very interesting, but there isn't necessarily an interesting problem or issue that you have to solve here with public policy. You're just asking the what happens question. Second one is similar. What happens if we change assumption Z of the X model? What happens if we change the assumption that refugee claims rise as lag times in the court system grow based on the Faulkner model? I won't go into what that means right there, but the risk that you run into is that you end up just changing my arguments and reframing sort of the questions of what occurs, what happens there, without necessarily considering a larger narrative or reproducing your own public policy problem or issue. And finally, what happens if I re-estimate John Doe's model using Alberta data? Again, that sounds like a very quant or a very quantitatively based question, but it's not necessarily. You could say, what if I redo the Los Angeles case study on medical services for homeless individuals using Alberta's data? Well, lots of things can happen. But again, there isn't an inherent in there a public policy issue or problem that's there to be solved. All you're doing is you're taking somebody else's work and redoing it with somebody else's model. It's not quite plagiarism per se, but it doesn't really add anything new. It doesn't contribute anything new to the issue, other than perhaps producing some new Alberta data. Now, if you do your own case study and in the process look up the case studies of others and decide there is a unique aspect of Alberta's issue with persons experiencing homelessness that you want to resolve, that is certainly a valid way to reapply the model. But again, you don't just want to start off with the basis. You start off with the issue of Calgary. If you're looking at homelessness, you start off with the issue of homelessness in Calgary first, and then look at what others have said, and then try to maybe apply or rework their work to understand the Alberta case. You don't start with the work that others have done and decide, well, I'm just going to redo this, but with Alberta data. Start with your problem first, and then you want to consider what others are doing. Now, the big caveat here, the caveat is that you can extend the research of a top capstone project done for the school, or let's say work done for a top publication at a journal on public policy, if there are aspects to those research questions which are incompletely or imperfectly answered. So let's say you went and looked at my capstone, and I encourage you not to, simply because there's a very glaring spelling issue right there near the beginning. But let's say you did go and look at my capstone anyways, laughed briefly at my spelling mistakes. And then you said, well, looking beyond the spelling mistakes, looking at Faulkner's capstone research project, he does an interesting job on looking how refugee finances affect their housing affordability here in Calgary, but there's more to be done. Faulkner just looked at social assistance benefits. What if we looked at the addition of family finances here in well? What if they have family here in Alberta? What if we compared refugees who have family in Calgary already and how they receive financial help versus refugees who don't have any family in Calgary? What is the role of informal financial aid from families in Calgary? That is a very cool, very interesting way. That is a paper I would be interested in reading. Because again, there's this problem here that refugees experience issues with housing affordability in Calgary. Faulkner's research answers that in part, but there's more to be answered here. It isn't just what happens if we consider the finances. It's not just looking at Faulkner's work and saying what happens if we add the addition of informal family financial support. It's still looking at again, there's this larger issue of refugee housing affordability in Calgary. I don't think Faulkner fully answers that. I'm going to add to it or about Faulkner. The key thing here is make sure that your extension says something new, and that in this case, the newness would be that Faulkner didn't sufficiently consider the role of informal financial aid from family members, and that's something that you're going to add to the discourse. Now I'm going to give you an exercise that hopefully helps finalize your research question. Think about the topic of your research proposal. State the question, that is the research question, in a yes/no format. Do soda taxes reduce obesity? Establish then how important the question is. Are many people worse off or better off? Are some people, like a particular subgroup, far better off or far worse off? Does the subject involve large public or private expenditures in fiscal, time, or personnel resources? If empirical, does the question resolve an important theoretical puzzle? If qualitative, can we use political, narrative, or other public policy theories to predict the best outcome? Does the topic involve common situations, that is, situations many Canadians or Albertans are familiar with? If you can answer these questions, it'll help you create a solid research question that will help you in your 3-minute thesis, your capstone research proposal, and in later writing your actual capstone project. Okay, it's 3-minute thesis time. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to outline what your analysis will do and why. You're going to convey what it adds to the contribution on public policy research. Let's take the Mince Basel example. Mince Basel, a while ago, estimated what a sales tax would do for Alberta's fiscal finances and how it could interact with other tax policy reforms. You're there doing your 3-minute thesis. You're not going to say you're going to revisit the Mince Basel estimates of a sales tax because it's been a while and you want to redo it. What you can say is that you're going to revisit the Mince Basel estimates with high quality data on provincial revenues that have changed with the fall in the price of oil, because the assumptions Mince and Basel used in their estimates have changed, and you need to consider the larger picture now of low oil prices. That is the new that is being added in this particular example. You need to lay out your assumptions that give rationale to your theory, model, or research question. Connect it to a well-defined policy or welfare question. You need to quickly describe your data. Data in this case means both qualitative and quantitative information that informs your research. State the source, prevent confusion later. Nobody should wonder, where did the data come from? How was the data measured? Using a city example, is it measured at the city of Calgary level or the metropolitan area? You should anticipate concerns. Is the data reliable? Will the data sources get back to you soon enough if you haven't already got it? For the purposes of your 3-minute thesis, keep the sources simple. It is okay to say that data comes from Statistics Canada. You don't need to say that the data comes from the Statistics Canada longitudinal immigrant database. That just wastes time. Make sure you get credit. This will make you stand out in the 3-minute thesis and in future research proposals where you're looking for grants, jobs, or other contracts. Advocate for why you're cool, awesome, and a great researcher. Get credit for new data. Let's say you go to an energy profit and that energy nonprofit gives you a very cool, unique data set nobody else has seen. Advocate if you got new ways of measuring things. Using again an energy example, let's say you go out there and you say, we measure risk aversion by oil companies by reimbursements for travel meals. That's funky, it's new, it's interesting, and it's a very interesting way of measuring risk aversion. Is it the best way? No, and there might be questions about that particular example. Point I'm trying to make here is that if you have to think of a very creative way to think about things, you need to state that in your 3-minute thesis. You also want to state the new sources of variation in the data. The Great Sourdough Shock of 2020 revealed this about this data aspect. Look for shocks, look for variations in the data that might make for very cool public policy analysis. All of these things will help contribute to you possibly winning the prize, and will certainly contribute later on when you're using your research proposal to get grants, jobs, contracts, and other aspects to advance your career. Preview the findings for your audience. Assume the audience is about to walk out. In this case, they are. You only have 3 minutes. And you want to make sure they leave with something, that they have an idea of what you might find. Again, this can be hard when you actually haven't written your capstone yet, but hopefully by this time you've done enough research into your topic that you can have an idea of where you want to go with it and what you might find, or even what you hope to find. These are all perfectly good ways of previewing your findings to your audience. You want to tantalize the audience, but in a terse manner. You want to provide a little bit of your methodology, which cements the possibility of the research project in the minds of your audience, but not too much of your methodology, to give you some room to, again, put out those early findings and ideas or what you hope to find. This last phrase, how you'll make sure to catch yourself before you wreck yourself. You're going to quickly state possible pitfalls you might find in doing your research and how you're going to address those. Again, short but sweet. The next 3 slides are just examples of good, bad, and the ugly in terms of the detail you want to provide for a 3-minute thesis. This right here provides a good level of detail for your thesis. You might not include this all in your slide. Remember, you only have 1, but it's just a couple bullet points on some early findings of your data or what you hope to find or what you hope to ask. This is based on a project where you might look at what would subsidized childcare do for women's wages in Alberta. The counterfactual might be, what would happen to women's wages if there was a free daycare program for women here in Alberta? And these just forecast some initial findings or what you hope to find or what you hope to ask. This is a good level of detail. This is probably not enough detail. If you were to say something like this, that, well, from what we think might happen, most of the childcare policy will fall on women. But not enough detail. You include a couple bullet points there, specifically how much incidence, what do we expect to happen, what do we hope to find, etc. Not enough detail in this particular example. This is too much. Way too much detail, especially for a 3-minute thesis. You're going to run out the clock very, very quickly and not get a whole lot out there. This might be perfectly fine as part of your actual capstone research project, but be careful not to over-explain what you hope to find or what your initial findings are. The end result, you've come to the end of your 3-minute thesis, and here's the hoped for outcomes. that the audience believes in your questions, that they think they're important, that they understand what you're trying to analyze and how you're going to analyze it, and understands what you'll do with your data, which kind of dovetails into the how of the previous bullet point. If you don't accomplish this, the audience might be lost. No one will be able to appreciate how interesting your findings will be. And the 3MT is lost. You just don't know it yet. You've gone out, exited the room, and you're not going to get the $500 prize, but no pressure. A note on your one slide you can bring into the 3-minute thesis. Every word on that slide is precious. Slides should be clear, not over-designed. They should be sparse, no extra details. Don't put anything in there that you didn't plan to talk about. The slide should be speaking with your voice. Can you hear me speaking in this? Well, of course you can, because I'm actually speaking. But if you were to pause this and read the bullet points again, could you hear my voice in the slide's details? As an example here, I purposely left this with way too much white space. You want to fill this slide in an organized, clear way, but you don't want to leave too much space there that could be used for details for your capstone project. A final note on pacing. No pauses. Do not pause unless you really want to stress something. In conclusion, you're working hard on your proposal. You also need to work hard on communicating it. Make sure others care about the question, understand how you answer it, and know why they should believe you. Practice it, and practice it a lot. Also, please take advantage of the fact that you have a junior researcher, that's me, willing to listen to you, who has written a lot of papers, presented to numerous official and non-official audiences, and made plenty of mistakes in doing so, and wrote a capstone themselves. I'm happy to meet with you whenever. Please get a hold of me. I'm happy to go through your 3-minute thesis and proposal and help you form one of the best capstone projects that have come out of the School of Public Policy.